Welcome, and thanks very much for joining us in this conversation. Personally, I'm very glad to have this time to talk with trusted colleagues. So often we're caught up in what we're doing, facing millions of challenges, but we do need time to think. I'm sure we all value thinking on our own, but we do need to chew things over with our colleagues. And I think that's one of the hard things about the pandemic. There have been fewer opportunities for us to talk to each other. We've got strong shared values, but outside reason, equality is all too often used as a political football, and some equality debates have got really toxic. We're starting in a very solid place. Unison's strong commitment to equality. That isn't in doubt. But that doesn't mean we know how to respond in every situation. Hostile debate can leave us hard and feeling unsure. Now, we're not going to attempt to come up with all the answers now. We're not experts in solving it all. What we are is a group of trusted colleagues who talk about equality with each other, and we want to widen the conversation. The plan is that this will be the first in a series of recorded conversations between different groups of colleagues. So let's get started.
So we're going to start off thinking about the word woke, which has become one of those words that has some baggage attached to it. We've seen increasing use of the term woke, often with sort of inverted commas around it or using phrases like the woke agenda. We see it quite often in backlash to the big social movements. So for instance, Black Lives Matter in particular, but also increasing calls for trans rights and those kind of things. Woke is quite an interesting word because it actually emerged in the 60s and 70s as a term used by African Americans, and it was used in a positive way to describe people who had become aware of the racism and inequality that was happening, obviously as part of the civil rights movement. So they'd sort of opened their eyes, they'd kind of awoken to what was going on. So it's sort of, you could hear it around that time in the 60s and 70s as a term that was used. More recently, in the sort of late 2010s into 2020s, it sort of came back into use a bit more, kind of as part of the BLM, the Black Lives Matter movement. Similarly, to mean the same thing, the idea that if someone was woke, they'd kind of opened their eyes, they'd started to see what was actually happening. However, and this often happens when a term is used by a minoritized group, woke has been kind of hijacked and the meaning has been sort of changed, and it's now used to essentially undermine people's intentions. It's become, in a lot of sectors, quite a sort of derogatory term. So that's a sort of short potted history on the word woke. I think what's more interesting is kind of maybe not so much the word, but why it's used the way it is and who it's used by and for what purposes. But Anna, let's go to you on this first in terms of your experience, your thoughts around this term and its sort of use and misuse.
Yeah, it's definitely used in a derogatory sense. It's used as an insult, particularly on social media. You can't really get away from it. Any sort of documents, any statements on social justice, usually underneath you'll find a lot of comments or people talking about woke as an insult, and it's normally followed by something like PC gone mad, lefty, and various other phrases to make the point that it is an insult. There are definitely people who take it at its original meaning, its literal sense, and are quite proud to have that term associated with them. But then you get the people in the middle who are sort of on the fence about it, and with all the negativity surrounding the term. I mean, the question is, are they swayed more to the negative terminology when they hear particularly people in the media, so-called celebrities, using it? And I think it's used as a way of showing that there are people, in its negative sense, as a way of showing that there are people that are trying to take something away from the people that have already got it, rather than showing that it's something that's designed to, as you said, about show what the inequalities are so that you're awake to the inequalities. And I think ultimately, people that use it in a negative sense are shutting down any conversations. Because if you're having a conversation with somebody and they start coming out with insults and they're turning the original meaning on its head, it's then difficult to progress that conversation. And you're not speaking about important issues. You're not addressing inequalities, you're not addressing injustice, because you've got somebody who's in essence mocking what you're saying or mocking who you are, and that's quite a personal thing as well. There definitely seems to be a bit of a growing culture war between the sort of woke and the non-woke, and as I say, definitely stoked by media personalities. But I think this is a really important conversation to have, because just because some voices are louder, it doesn't mean that they're right.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. And I think the point you made as well about the people maybe in the middle, or people who maybe don't, whose day job isn't in, say, D&I, who aren't thinking about this all the time. If the messages they're hearing, if they're hearing those louder voices, are they getting pulled to that side of things because those voices have more volume behind them? Or it's people that they think, well, this is a person in the public eye, or this is a person with power or status, so I should sort of trust what they say. I think that's one of the sort of trickier sides of social media, is that all those narratives and all those voices, it can be hard to pick through sort of who to trust and who to listen to.